Hello and welcome back to Paleocast. My name is Dave Marshall and today's interview, episode 86, is with Professor Kevin Boyce of Standford University and is all about coal. This subject was another listener request we got way back in early 2017, so it goes to show that we do try to respond to all of your requests. So don't ever be afraid to get in touch if you want to make your own suggestions, or even if you just want to chat about fossils. We'd love to hear from you. A big thanks to all of you who've donated to the show at the start of this year. I know some of you make donations every month, some annually, and others whenever you can afford it. A few more of you have been helping out recently, and it's all really appreciated, and it all goes to good use. Welcome to all of our new listeners. It's always good to have you along for the journey, and this interview should really encapsulate what Paleocast is all about. Now, we don't just talk about dinosaurs, but we try to cover as many different organisms as possible, and from as many different geological periods as possible. And we're not just about name-checking either. This episode gets into a lot of the details about what coal is and how it's formed, but also we discuss theories as to why its preservation isn't consistent throughout all of geological time. On Paleocast, we're excited to learn about the bigger picture and to ask bigger questions like, how did this happen? And most importantly, why? So just before we get into this episode, I'd like to ask that you like, share, and subscribe to the show wherever you can. And if you can leave us a rating, we'd be super grateful. We hope you enjoy this interview. Hi Kevin, thanks very much for joining us.
Sure, happy to be here.
Right, in every single interview we do, we like to get to know the interviewee a little better. So can you start us off by giving us a quick introduction to yourself, please?
I'm a paleontologist. I've worked primarily with plant fossils, and I like to think about how fossil organisms would have actually worked as organisms. That can involve worrying about how they would have grown and developed, or it can worry about their structure and biochemistry and what their cell walls are made out of, or it can be more along the lines of the physiology and how they conducted photosynthesis and so on. But I like to think about them as organisms and what we can do with that information.
And so how did you begin working in paleobotany? Like, if you think of paleontologist, you instantly think T-Rex. So why did you decide to go down the route of plants?
I had no kind of I'm not a plant person. I didn't have any kind of preconceived need to study plants. But I liked the questions that I could answer with them, because with animals, you end up with some shells or some bones, and that's about it. Whereas you can actually get much more detailed preservation with plant fossils. So you can ask more interesting questions with them.
Sure. And if you weren't a paleontologist, what would you be doing with yourself?
What would I be doing? I think I would have to still be an academic of some flavor or other. Mm-hmm. I like asking questions I find interesting and not worrying too much about whether it makes anyone money or anything like that. I guess I could be a historian or something like that. I've always liked literature and so on. I guess I could be in a variety of directions within academia, but I don't know if I'd be much good outside of academia.
Right. So today's interview is based on a listener request that we got in, and it's going to be all about coal. So the most obvious place to start is by asking you to define what coal actually is.
Good listener. What is coal? Coal is accumulated biomass that has had the time to be squeezed and cooked and so on for a long time, so that it's been altered into a form of it's still organic matter, but it's been modified to a form that's no longer biological and is now kind of a geochemical constituent of the environment. But ultimately, coal is very old plants that have kind of gone through diagenesis and geological processes.
Right, so you said biomass initially. That was incredibly vague. Anything organic. Can it be anything? Can it be animals as well as plants?
Sure. It's so in just in the world now, plants are most of the biomass. They're most of the actual kind of biological activity is still going to be the vegetation. So there's definitely kind of little bits of animals getting preserved in coal. We can see them in the fossils, but most of that material is going to be coming from the plants.
So if we focus just on the plants then for this episode, we understand that there's animals that get included into coal, but for the most part, it's going to be plants. So what is it of the plants that actually gets turned into coal?
It can be just about any aspect of the plant can be preserved to some degree. So you're always kind of doing the math of things are decaying and things are accumulating, and some things make it through and get preserved. So the more accumulating, the more you can get preserved to some degree. And then within the material that's accumulating, some aspects of the plant will decay slower than others. So there's things that go away very quickly, and certainly things like DNA and so on. There are things that go away more slowly, like cellulose, which is a component of cell walls. And then there's other things like lignan, which is it's an aromatic compound that's also part of cell wall, which is relatively tough. And so over time, you will enrich the things that are more resistant to decay, and you'll lose the things that are more susceptible to decay. But ultimately, all aspects of the material can get preserved to some degree.
Can you expand a little bit about what lignin actually is?
So all plants have cell walls, which are kind of little kind of carbohydrate investments of each cell outside of the cell membranes. And all cell walls involve carbohydrates. In land plants, as in green algae, it tends to be cellulose, which is the same thing as glucose, just kind of bound together into long chains in a slightly different way than they're bound together in starch. So it's a basic kind of component of biochemistry that is in all our food and everything else. Cellulose is hydrophilic. It likes water. And so the cellulose gets kind of bound into these long fibers that wrap around the cell. And water, to some degree or another, can disrupt that by kind of also binding with those fibers. Lignin is another thing that kind of gets pushed into all the spaces within a cell wall. Sometimes, not always. Not all plants have lignin. Just the vascular plants do. This one lineage that includes conifers and ferns and flowering plants and all that kind of stuff, and oak trees and so on. And what happens is lignin is a very complex polymer that has a very irregular structure, but is hydrophobic. And so it gets kind of pushed into all the spaces in a way that it excludes water and strengthens the cellulose fibrils that are there. So it's something that both makes the walls tougher and more resistant to decay and attack by fungi and stuff like that. And it also makes them stronger, more strong biomechanically, so that, because the tissues that are lignified are ultimately what are holding up a tree, right? That's the wood. That's lignified vascular tissue. And so it makes it stronger in a variety of ways for different purposes. But it's an alternative biochemistry that's found in the same cell walls. So all cell walls have cellulose. Some cell walls in this one lineage also have lignin added to them.
Are lignin and coal production linked to each other?
Yeah. So it's certainly thought of in those terms. And if you had to pick out one molecule to be the biggest contributor to coal, lignin's a perfectly good choice. But that doesn't mean that all coal is lignin.
Now, moving on to the production of coal, what are the stages of coal formation?
It begins with a living plant, lots of living plants, and they die. Their organic matter can accumulate or it can rot. Right, that's step one. Is either it goes away or it stays. In the modern world, there's lots of herbivores that eat things, but they don't eat all that much. Most of it, half of it at least. It depends on where you are in the world, but at least half of it is still going to be going through some type of just decay. And so if stuff survives that decay, it can accumulate and become coal eventually or not. So when people talk about the stages of coal formation, the earliest thing that's recognized is called a peat, which is just an accumulation of dead organic matter. It can involve peat moss in the modern world, which They're kind of associated with each other. But the term peat is more general, and it can just be any accumulation of relatively undegraded vegetative organic matter. And then from there, it can get progressively altered by geological processes, by heat and pressure. It alters the chemistry so that even by the time you're looking at proper coal, all right, it goes up through lignite and bituminous and anthracite and all these different kind of ranks of coal, depend upon how much the chemistry, the original organic chemistry, the original biochemistry has been altered. So that eventually you end up with a situation where even if you know you're looking at a chunk of fossil wood within coal, and these situations happen, it doesn't mean any of that chemistry exactly looks like lignin. It's all been altered. The various backbones of the polymers get cleaved. You lose functional groups like alcohol groups and stuff like that. So all the complex organic chemistry, it can be simplified, it can be modified, it can actually kind of build up alternative complex chemistries. But it doesn't look like what it originally was. So over time, you kind of squeeze out a lot of this stuff, and you end up with a higher carbon content, certainly, and you're altering all the kind of chemistry around that.
If it does get changed so much, then what's the actual potential for discovering new scientific things out from coal? Are you able to look in there and see new plants, or is it all just been changed too much?
Yeah, so there's a couple studies where people have kind of looked and said, wow, here's an actual just black chunk of coal, and we've been able to identify spores in it and stuff like that. And there's different coal types where that's easier or harder to do, where there's coal types that are built up of leaf cuticles and stuff like that. But typically when we talk about fossils coming from coal, it's not from compressed black coal. It's from one of two things. It's either the layers of mineral matter, shale and so on, that underlie or go above the coal, right? Because so that vegetation is being compressed in place. The underlying soil with a mineral content to it, you can actually be preserving in 2 dimensions the same plants that were then contributing to the coal that comes above it. And the mineral matter above it can have roots growing down through and all that kind of thing. But more importantly, for a lot of kind of context of paleontology, is often very early in the formation of coal, when it's still a peat, basically. You can get mineral nodules, often of calcium carbonate, growing. They just kind of nucleate on the organic matter, and they grow. They form like these little rock eggs within that organic matter. So that later on, when everything gets compressed and heated and turned into coal, whatever happened to be preserved inside that little egg of calcium carbonate, and I guess they don't have to be very little, they can be pretty boulder-sized masses, doesn't get compressed. So people then can take these coal balls, as they're called, section them up on a saw, and look at thin sections in various ways. And there's uncompressed plant matter there, perfectly preserved very often, where you can see all the cells, all of the detail in that regard. It doesn't protect the chemistry from being modified, but what it does do is that it gives you an uncompressed stem of a plant, for example, and I can look at that and know which tissues should have been lignified and which tissues should not have been lignified based on comparisons to living plants, and then look at the organic chemistry as it is preserved and have some sense of where that chemistry came from as far as original biochemistry. So when we talk about fossils from coal, we're not talking about coal itself. We're talking about kind of the fringes of these things, either the rock underlying the coal or above the coal, or these nodules that form within the coal and resist compression and compaction.
So I don't need to be going over to my grandma's house and she's got a coal fire going, and I don't have to be jumping in there going, no, there could be plant fossils in there. It's already too late.
You don't have to feel guilty about that. You can worry about other aspects of burning that coal, but you don't have to feel guilty about that.
Right. What are some of the factors that prevent the formation of coal?
Things rot. There's very few kind of actual environments where you can expect to accumulate this stuff. If it's just sitting on the surface, if you've ever seen a compost heap, you know what happens. It goes away. And there's lots of things live off of it, all the fungi and the various microbial activity and stuff like that. So you need some way to stop that decay process from happening. And in practice, where that happens are in wet environments where the substrate, the soil, is waterlogged, and it can go anoxic, and that prevents a lot of these decay processes. So all this stuff is accumulating basically in swampy environments, in wetland environments. And outside of those environments, it's not going to work. And even within those environments, it doesn't help you to make a peat if it's then going to erode away 1,000,000 years later, 1,000 years later. It also has to be an environment where over time it's sinking so that you can accumulate more stuff on top. So in any kind of this doesn't have to be coal or organic matter, any geological process within kind of sedimentary geology and the movement of sand or silt or whatever, if you want to accumulate rock, you need a hole that you can fill with that rock. So you need a source of the rock, a source of the sediment, and you need a place to put it rather than it just getting eroded away. So you need a wetland to make coal. You need plants, but it's not enough to have plants. You have to have a wetland where they will resist decay. And then it's not enough to have a wetland. You have to have a wetland in an environment where over long geological time spans that is accumulating sediment and organic matter, rather than being eroded. So you need all of those processes to come together.
Is there a minimum amount of plant material that you need?
No, in the sense that there's always little bits. You need a sedimentary environment where you're accumulating stuff. But in any sedimentary environment, in theory, you can accumulate little bits of coalified, as it's often called, organic matter. So in a shale or some other kind of silty, mudstony kind of environment, you can have leaf fossils. You wouldn't call that leaf fossil a coal, but it very often can have little black coaly bits of organic matter. And it's not unfair to compare that stuff to coal. So there's no minimum amount for preservation. Although in practice, you do need to resist decay. And in part, having all of that organic matter in a wetland is what drives it to anoxia in the first place, to retard that decay. So a little bit of isolated organic matter is not going to make its environment anoxic. So in theory, it could decay away unless it's being buried quickly enough by more input of mud or something like that. But in theory, there's no minimum amount of plant that you need to make a little bit of coal.
Right. We should head back in time now and have a look at the geological record. So we know that the Carboniferous period was named after its large coal deposits. And I'd like to get to the bottom of why this period in particular has so much coal production. But first, let's take a step back even further still. And if we go to before trees evolved, could coal still be produced at that time?
Yes, sure. So trees show up in the Middle Devonian, so that's like 380 million years ago. And vascular plants, the things that have the lignin, that have vascular tissue and stuff like that, and move water around through their insides, they showed up a little bit before that in the late Silurian, so like 420 million years ago. And there is coal in the time in between. There's not a lot of it, but I've seen it, and it's coal. There it is. There's certainly coal from like the early Devonian, so more like 400 million years ago. So it is prior to trees. It can exist.
Is it chemically any different?
There's not a lot of people that bother to look at that, and I guess that would kind of be me. I wasn't looking for differences, but I wouldn't expect it to be noticeably different in that regard. So the plants going into it they don't have wood, so there's in theory there might have been less lignin content to it, the original inputs to what became that coal. But I haven't looked at detail on what came out the other side.
So in the Devonian, we get our first forests, as you said. Do we similarly see a huge increase in the amount of coal being produced?
Yeah, yes, but they're not exactly tied to each other as you might think from the way that was phrased. Trees show up in the Middle Devonian around 380, 385 million years ago. There were certainly good forests by the end of the Devonian, so more in the 370, 360, 350 range. There's coal from all that. But when people think about coal and the Carboniferous and all the street urchins in the Dickens novels covered with dirty faces and all that kind of stuff, that is the later Carboniferous. So that's more like 320 million years ago. So there is a lag between when you first get forests and when you really get hugely abundant coal. The Industrial Revolution is the late Carboniferous. Everything we burned in the Industrial Revolution is the late Carboniferous. So it did come later than those first forests.
So let's move ahead to that period then, that time 320 million years ago. What has changed that's allowing all of this coal to be produced?
Well, there's different answers to that. One thing that's come up a lot over the years is as I mentioned, there's different factors kind of are involved in coal input. There's production of the organic matter of the vegetation. There's having a place to put it. There's accumulation. There's decay, and you have to kind of, it's basically an algebraic equation, and how all those things work out determine whether you get coal or not. So you could either up production, or you could lower decay, or you could just worry about having a place to accumulate the coal. All of those things, in theory, could decide whether you have coal or not. One thing that has come up over the years is the notion that either there was more production or that there was a lot less decay. And that feeds into a particular notion that's come up over the years, which is that the thought that most lignin decay now is by fungi. And the thought is that, well, maybe fungi couldn't do that decay prior to much later in time, after all this Carboniferous coal accumulated. And that the reason we have all this coal is because the fungi weren't there to eat up all that organic matter in the first place, all that lignin in the first place. That's one notion. There are kind of already immediately kind of perhaps problems you can think about with what I've just said already, which is that there are forests there in the Devonian, but there's not that much coal there in the Devonian, and there's not that much coal from the early Carboniferous. It's only really kind of ballooning out in the late Carboniferous. So if you wanted to come down to lignin decay and fungi either being able to decay that or not, you might expect the pattern to match up much more closely with the evolutionary pattern of the plants than it actually does. You wouldn't expect that kind of a lag situation.
So the evolutionary lag hypothesis that the fungi hadn't evolved yet enough to be able to decay all of the wood, what kind of evidence is there that supports that?
Yeah, so I disagree with it, but there's actually a very kind of important progress that's involved in this idea that I think doesn't work out, which is just that people have suggested that going back decades, that maybe there's just less decay available prior to later in the record. But they were talking about fungi as this kind of big amorphous mass because we didn't understand how the various fungi were related to each other in any very precise way. It's only in recent years that the phylogeny, the evolutionary tree of fungi, has been worked out to a point where you can really see whether that makes sense or not. And when that was done, the groups that did it, they're molecular people coming from the systematics of fungi. What they found is that the lineages that are capable of decaying lignin are fairly derived within the phylogeny of fungi. And when they try to look at the time, when they try to kind of match that up with the time scale, the geological time scale, based on using a molecular clock kind of approach, what they found was that they were seeing the evolution of these fungi kind of coming in the Permian, right after the Carboniferous. So it was a very reasonable thing on their part to kind of revive this idea that had been around for decades, that maybe the reason we had all this coal in the Carboniferous is because there were no fungi to degrade it. So that it makes sense in that sense, from a matching up these two records sense, but it doesn't work in any number of other ways. Most notably, I mean, if you just kind of take it at face value, there was nothing to decay lignin, and then there was, that would just destroy the planet. There's a lot of lignin production, and at any one time, a very vanishingly small fraction of organic matter actually gets preserved in the geological record. If there's any imbalance in that system, the whole world comes crashing down. Either you run out of carbon dioxide and the whole world freezes, or you get too much carbon dioxide and the whole world turns into Venus. These things always have to be pretty balanced. So just the statement of there was no lignin decay, I mean, that can't possibly be true. Because there's an enormous amount of lignin production every year, and if even a big fraction of that ended up as coal, we would run out of carbon dioxide. We wouldn't be able to have vegetation and so on in the first place. So there had to have been lignin degradation throughout this time period, and there's a variety of things other than this one lineage that could do that. There's other fungi that can do it to various smaller degrees. There are bacteria that can be involved in these processes. And we can actually kind of, in some fossils from the Devonian where we have wood, we can see fungi in them. We can see aspects of rot in them. So these processes had to have been going on. They might not have been quite as efficient, or, I mean, in whatever kind of vague sense you want to think about that. But there's always has to be a pretty good balance between production and decay in this regard. So in that sense, also that fungal lag, even if it's evocative, it's persuasive in some levels, but it couldn't work out in that regard.
So why don't we see production of coal after the Carboniferous?
We absolutely do, and it's more a question of why there's so much of it in the Carboniferous versus later times. And the key is that even in the Carboniferous, if you look locally, if you go to Yorkshire in the UK or wherever where a lot of this coal is accumulating in the Carboniferous, the rates of accumulation aren't going to be that different from the rates of accumulation in, say, the Cenozoic, the early Cenozoic, in Western North America, like the Powder River Basin and stuff like that. So when coal accumulates, there's a rate at which it accumulates, and that's kind of okay. And it's going to be dictated by how fast the bottom is dropping out of the basin, and whether the plant matter can keep up, and how much can accumulate and stuff like that. But the rates of accumulation within a basin aren't going to necessarily be that different through time. The key strangeness of the Carboniferous is more that how come there was so much accumulating on a global scale relative to why are there so many active basins at once, basically? If the rates are going to be relatively similar between any two basins between now and different points in Earth history. And that starts to get into really kind of there's two environmental parameters that have really nothing to do with the vegetation that intersected each other in this chunk of the Paleozoic, which is, well, I mean, plants do matter in the sense that without forests and vascular plants and swamps, you're not going to get much accumulation in any case. But in the 420 million years that we've had this, had a vascular flora on the land, there is a narrow intersection of two other parameters, which is when in Earth history have we had a wet tropics, because the tropics aren't always that wet. Now we have ever wet rainforests, and we have summer wet savannas kind of on either side of that. It all has to do with the tropical rainy belt, the intertropical convergence zone, which is going to move back and forth across the equator with the seasons. And as that tropical rainy belt moves back and forth, is there a place in the middle where there's overlap and there's kind of always a lot of rainfall? Or and how much is the system instead dominated by places where it's only wet in the summers? And where it's only wet in the summers, that's where you get savannas and big grasslands now and stuff like that. And now we have tropical rainforests. And we had tropical rainforests at this point in the Paleozoic, in the Carboniferous. And they're very different. The vegetation is completely different. But so I shouldn't say tropical rainforest. But we did have an ever wet tropical system. The time period in between the Carboniferous and the Cenozoic we don't really have that. If you look throughout the Mesozoic, all those dinosaur time periods and stuff like that, what you tend to have are summer wet systems through the tropics, more akin to our modern savannas. And those are not going to have an accumulation, the potential for accumulation in the same way. You can have coal forming at low latitudes in the tropics. You can have coal forming at high latitudes, all the peats in Ireland and Scotland and stuff like that, right? That's obviously not in the tropics, but they're wet environments. So you need wet environments. But overall productivity is going to be higher in warm tropical environments. So it matters having a wet tropics. And we had that in the Carboniferous, and we have it now, and we didn't have it in the time periods in between. So that's half of it. And then the other half is the holes being available to be filled with coal. And that was much more available then than now. In the modern world, the tropics, or tropical landmasses, a lot of them are surrounded by passive margins. So you're not having kind of basins that are accumulating a lot of sediments. Whereas back in the Paleozoic, this is when we're forming the supercontinent Pangaea. And a lot of things are coming together, and there's a lot of mountain ranges. And where you have a mountain range, you have a source of sediment, and you also will tend to have basins alongside those mountain ranges that are subsiding, that are sinking. So you have holes actively being formed that you can fill up with things like coal. And Pangaea really is a global phenomenon. It's happening kind of throughout the tropics between a whole bunch of different continents. And it even really it continues, this kind of coal age of the Paleozoic, it continues right up to the end of the Permian, specifically if you look to China. Right? The coal is long gone by the end of the Permian if you are in North America or you're in Europe. Those places have dried out by then, but it continues elsewhere. But this is all this large belt of tectonic activity associated with Pangaea and all the various continental blocks coming together that give you the holes to fill. And that happened to be at a time when we had a wet tropics where those holes being filled could be covered with wetlands that are allowing accumulation of coal. So coal is always there throughout history. There's one little period after the Permian extinction where people say there's no coal, and maybe that's true. But in general, as long as we've had vegetation on land, there has been some coal accumulation. And it's just that the only time when we could globally get a heck of a lot of coal was back at this earlier time period.
So that's a nice overview of what's happened with coal in the past. But if we look to the future, how do you see coal production taking place? Is it going to increase? Is it going to decrease? If we manage to meet the Paris Climate Agreement of 1.5 degrees warming, what would coal production look like then?
Ooh. There's a lot of different things in there. The easy thing is, sure, there will always be kind of wetlands and accumulation of organic matter that over time can become coal. All those processes are still going on. Will they increase or decrease or stay the same? We can look at the various components of that. There is a tendency of humans to fill in wetlands and build department stores on top of them and stuff like that, and hotels. There's always some risk that people identify that these environments are a sink of carbon dioxide, and if we get rid of them, that's a problem. So there's certainly land use issues that go into that. There are questions of how plants will respond with their productivity to increasing carbon dioxide, because obviously carbon dioxide is something plants need. It's one of the basic kind of components of photosynthesis. And there's some expectation that as carbon dioxide rises, a counteracting force against that will be the fact that the plants might be more productive. And that might help kind of buffer those increases and kind of lower it won't stop them from going up, but it would lower the trajectory, I guess. That's, on some basic level, that should go on to some degree, but plants also aren't just made out of carbon, and you have to worry about where they're getting their other nutrients and whether that can keep up or not. It's kind of widely in ecology and stuff like that, people look at carbon-nitrogen ratios and carbon-nitrogen phosphorus ratios, and yes, carbon comes from the sky and from carbon dioxide. And if you increase the amount of CO2, then maybe plants can do a little bit more photosynthesis. But that's not necessarily going to immediately lead to increases in nitrogen availability. Nitrogen also does come from the sky, but via symbiotic microbes and stuff like that. And phosphorus straight up just comes from rocks and they're the weathering of rocks. So all of that would have to kind of work out to see kind of any significant increases in productivity. And it probably would in some environments and not work out in others. And that gets into all the complexity that people worry about when they try to model these things. I guess on some level, the answer is whatever happens, it won't help us because that all operates. The things I just talked about will operate on a time scale that we work with, but the overall taking carbon dioxide out of the sky and making it coal, that's operating on time scales much longer than can help us. So I'm talking. You can tell I'm talking my way through this, thinking my way through this as I talk. But ultimately, it can't help us too much just because the coal is going to accumulate at rates that are way too slow relative to what we're doing to the atmosphere. There's a wonderful, terrifying, awful statistic that someone worked out, which is that we're burning through as we burn coal and petroleum and all that kind of stuff. As we use fossil fuels, we're using per year we're using 1 million years worth of accumulation. So it's one of these things where obviously you can't keep doing that, right? People worry about the climate aspects of that, and as they should, but also just on a mass balance level, you can't keep doing that forever the way we've been doing it. All of these processes work them out on very million-year timescales, 100,000-year timescales. Those aren't going to do us any good in that regard. We're burning through things in a non-geological way, so geology can't help us.
Right. So I'm fairly happy with all of what coal is and how it's been accumulated in the past. So let's move on and kind of summarize. Why is coal important scientifically? What can we learn from it?
So on some level, that's the thing. Why is the geological record important, right? And the name of your podcast is Paleocast. You probably have an answer for that. So it's an aspect of the geological record. It is Earth history right there, and it's a really kind of fun, unique aspect of that Earth history in the sense that it's rich in fossils, and yet it's also directly a part of the carbon cycle and so on. So there's a lot to be learned from that in that regard. Yeah, that's what I would say to that. Geology is important. Earth history is important, and coal is a big part of that.
How important is it to keep it in the ground and not burn it?
For climate or for Earth history?
For climate.
Climate. Good Lord, yeah. Don't. Yeah, very slight imbalances in the carbon cycle can have big impacts, right? Over long time periods, the volcanic output of CO2 and what eventually ends up in the oceans as carbonates or on land or in the oceans as organic matter, they basically have to exactly match. Otherwise, everything goes crazy. And they do almost exactly match. There are time periods where they go crazy. There's a time period early in the Cenozoic called the Paleocene thermal maximum, where it's still unclear what exactly happened, but there does appear to have been a big input of CO2 and such to the atmosphere and greenhouse gases. And things went crazy and got really warm for a bit. But that's like 50,000 years. There was a little input, and the Earth freaked out, and then these kind of systems worked that up through the system. But you can't just keep doing huge imbalances. And what we're doing right now is a very large imbalance. We're putting more in the atmosphere than can come out, and that's measurable, right? We're measurably increasing carbon dioxide. And on some level, yes, it is completely correct and natural to focus on, the doom of it all and the suffering that is inherent in what we'll be doing and all that kind of stuff. But you can also just kind of just do the math and say, you can't possibly keep doing that. It's just not possible to keep doing that. The system cannot handle large imbalances except as kind of short little perturbations. What we are now is a perturbation, and that can't continue. That's unavoidable in that sense.
And then you're speaking about the imbalance. If we look at the flip side of it, what impact did the deposition of all this coal have on the climate in the Carboniferous?
Yeah, so that's actually a good segue for that, in the sense that I don't know. Did it have to have big impacts, right? Because as I just was saying, that what we're doing now is a very fast, on a geological timescale. Humans are very fast, and we are a perturbation. We're not that different from a meteorite impact, and what we're doing will stop one way or another. It's just a question of how much damage we do before we stop it, or before it stops us. But if we're burning through 1 million years worth of organic matter per year as humans, then everything we're doing now, right, smear that out over 1 million years. What's the impact? Well, I don't know. We have plenty of other things going on over those timescales. So when we look back to the Carboniferous, there's a very large ice age back then, and it's very reasonable and natural to think that maybe all the deposition of this coal helped kind of promulgate that, because in theory that all that coal came out of the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. There are other ice ages earlier in the Paleozoic, in the late Devonian, in the Ordovician, that people have similarly in various ways tried to link to plants, and either kind of coal accumulation, as in the Carboniferous, or other aspects of what plants do to the environment, and weathering of rocks and stuff like that, as a sink of CO2. But when you ask, what did all that coal of the Carboniferous do? It might not have done very much, in the sense that it probably, it's going to do a little bit as far as CO2 concentrations and stuff like that. But accumulation rates are much slower than what we're doing now. So on the ground, it's not like you're necessarily looking at your watch waiting for the changes to occur. They're occurring over very long timescales. So yes, there was a big ice age in the Carboniferous, in the later Carboniferous, and surely feedbacks between the vegetation and climate was a part of that ice age. But it would be kind of hard to say all that coal caused the ice age or anything like that. And in fact, there would have been ice before the coal and stuff like that too. So what are the impacts? I don't know. But the imbalances, to the extent that these represent imbalances, they would have been very slight and very slow. And in general, it's kind of like the fungi thing of, if someone's suggesting an enormous impact, it almost has to be wrong, because if at various times in Earth history, I mean, people want there be feedbacks between the biology and the abiotic environment, and there surely are feedbacks. But if someone's suggesting an enormous feedback, there's a good problem that the math would blow up someplace, and it couldn't have been as large as that.
And then I guess the final thing to ask is, what is the future for coal research?
What is the future for coal research? Well, there's lots of different aspects of that. I suspect most coal research is on the lines of coal production and coal organic geochemistry. I'm not a real organic geochemistry chemist, as I just said. I can't even say it right. I'm not an organic geochemist. I work with them though, and I try to do my part of learning the things that matter for the questions I'm asking. So surely that all continues from a paleontologist perspective. The future is kind of the past. You were asking about your mother burning coal or your grandmother burning coal. I forget which relative it was, but that doesn't matter in the sense that the reason we know all these fossils in the first place is coal production. the reason a lot of the early paleontology literature from the 1800s is on Carboniferous plants is because Carboniferous plants sure did matter in the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution and all that coal production. And the people finding these fossils were the coal miners. And then they just kind of handed them along. And that aspect of it all certainly does not have a future. It doesn't have a present anymore in the sense that the way coal gets mined anymore, it's harder and harder to get fossils out as you go. You have these kind of big machines underground, and things are allowed to kind of just collapse afterwards. And the human labor involved that was actually finding these fossils and bringing out the coal balls and all that kind of stuff, that's kind of long gone. And you can't exactly wish for it to come back, given that there was a lot of turmoil associated with that as well and suffering. But a lot of these fossils get harder and harder to find. You're relying on outcrops and stuff like that. And honestly, with my research, I largely rely on what's already in museums. That's poorly stated. I basically exclusively rely on what's already in museums. So the future of that kind of paleontology research in some ways is also the past, because is an enormous amount of fossils available in museums, and lots of questions that can still be asked of them as our understanding of biology and so on progresses.
Okay, Kevin, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Paleocast was brought to you by Dave Marshall, with Joe Keating, Laura Soul, Liz Martin-Silverstone and Caitlin Colery. It was made possible by funding from the Paleontological Society and the Paleontological Association, but the show now relies on contributions from you, the listeners. If you've liked this episode, please consider donating, and thanks to everyone that's helped out so far. We'd also like to thank the Ocean Collective for use of their music. Please visit paleocast.com for the supplementary material to this episode and for our archive of past programmes. Subscribe to our Twitter feed @Paleocast and like us at facebook.com/Paleocast to get all the latest news.